part 2 of the Dura Spriting Guide, and this part is intangibles, or also style. Um, so this is mostly going to be theory and conceptual. Like the rest of this guide, abiding by these types of principles will make it pretty hard not to come up with something that's able to be put into Dura. So first thing to talk about is technology. What is Dura? I'm, you know, fundamentally, Dura is a game that's origins on a technological basis is in the 1990s. So it's pretty primitive. It is a 2D game. It is not a 3D game. It is a 2D game. Um, so that's kind of where you can start. So fundamentally, you have to understand that we have to understand that this game is limited in terms of its technological prowess. It is a 2D game. It is a low resolution game. It has one aerial perspective. Okay. So when you put all this together, you're talking about something that is primitive, that is limited in terms of what its technology is. Of course, though, you shouldn't look at it like that as a bad thing. In fact, you know, it's, for lack of a better term, if you're ever familiar with the phrase enabling limits, it it ends up making it so you actually have an incredibly cohesive, tight, and almost visual and very atmospheric art style. Um, Anyways, excuse the digression. So what we're trying to establish here is the technology. All right, I'm going to repeat. It is a 2D game. Um, so and it's a low resolution. Um, so you're limited with what you can do. So what that means is realism is a no-no. Trying to do things in this game visually, artistically, graphically that are realistic is not achievable. It is not going to end well. Okay? And I'm not talking about historically accurate and putting the culture on point and matching the world in terms of the artifacts and the materials within it. That's good. I'm talking about visually. It's not achievable to be realistic. Okay, so um, it really starts there. And the other thing I'm gonna start here, along with the technology being limited and it being 2D and all this other stuff, it also means that the style at root and what the style is going to benefit from is minimalism. Okay, minimalism. So that's really it. That's where we're gonna start. Now, what does that mean? Well, we said if your technology is limited, 2D and whatnot, realism is a no-no. Okay. Um, so let's step back for a moment and understand where this game came from. The virtue of this game is that it is created by essentially amateurs when it comes to its art direction. Now, it's true that originally the game actually pulls from a game called Ultima Online. I think specifically Ultima Online 6. And you're talking about very, very, very primitive, primitive visual pixel art. Extremely. Uh, but that's where the game's origin is. And anything that's expanded upon that is pulling from that origin. And and on top of it, where the art in Dura comes from is more or less created by amateurs, at least again in origin. Um, so what we need to think about is the actual skill set that pulled off this art direction and made it consistent and made it coherent. It are amateurs, and I'll touch on that for a moment. When it comes to things, whether it's in film or it's in music or even literature or even in this case games, especially with visual styles, sometimes if people think I think there's a belief that, well, you need to have talent and you need to have brilliance for something to really work, and something to be very impressive and remarkable. That's not always the case. I think a good example would be actually acting in cinema. So if a person is maybe not doing the best job at portraying a role, okay, he doesn't have the grasp of it, doesn't have the greatest amount of range in acting and portraying the character. Here's the thing though, if they are consistent, okay, if they are consistent, if for the entire minute, excuse me, the entire time they're on the screen for the length of the whole film or show, if they are always consistently doing the same thing, they speak the same way, they think the same way, they kind of intuit and feel the same way, they have the same mannerisms, the same characteristics, it allows us as the viewer to buy into it, okay? Um, in actual terms, in actual drama, it's called suspension of disbelief, and it's the case also in other works of art, including literature. If for a moment the viewer can actually suspend his disbelief that what he's watching is quote unquote pretend or fake, basically the artist is doing his job. Okay, so a lot of the times consistency can trump talent or ability. Okay, um, when it comes to Dur's art direction, what's important about it is even though it's created in origin by amateurs and it's primitive, it is consistent. It is always doing the same thing in terms of its style, and that creates something that we can buy into, something that we have belief in, which is why it's so important, all the things I'm talking about in this guide, to abide these principles, because if you do it, it is hard not for it to feel like, visually it just matches with the game. So so that was a little aside. Now the virtue of the game, like I said, is it's created by amateurs. You have to embrace that. Okay, so the way I think it's very healthy to think about it is, what do we all start doing when we're kids and we draw? What how do we what type of thing do we draw? Well, typically, at least in my country, I understand people here, our game is very multi well, it's global. um, but in my country, kids draw houses, right? Now there is a platonic image of a house. There's a box and a triangle at the top and a door and a window. Now what's important to understand is that, yeah, you have the technology, we talked about that, and yeah, you have the minimalism. But what did that lead to? It led to the notion that this game is not realism. It's not realistic. It's not realistic backed by some sort of physical laws or anatomical laws. It's not realistic in terms of how you do size, proportion, color. It's not realistic. Not either in texture either. So what does that mean? Well, what is it? It's impressionistic. Okay? It is impressionistic. If you're unfamiliar with what impressionism is, basically impressionism is the concept that to capture the spirit of something, you grab on to whatever is going to emotionally invoke in you the given thing, that you're going to have resonance with. So if it's ice cream, how do you capture ice cream? Well, a realistic image, right, of ice cream would be, uh, the cone and everything is in order and all that stuff. We know what a realistic ice cream cone is. But how do you do the impression? Well, it tastes really good. So perhaps you do a kind of a pink aura around it. You know, um, if it's a frankly, if it's a religious impressionism, then maybe you have a halo or an aura around the person. Now with a game, good example, right? Impressionism in a game means that if you have to draw, say, a frankly, a blueberry bush, since we're on screen here, there's a realistic way to draw a blueberry bush. But an impression of a blueberry bush is that it's a bush, so it's a green kind of amorphous circle, and then there are blue dots in it. Now that tells a person at impression that it's a blueberry bush. Okay, so maybe a little bit too much detail here, but what I'm trying to drive home is the game is not realistic visually. It is impressionistic. And the other way to think about that is it is platonic in its imagery. And that's why I brought up child drawings drawing houses. Okay? It's important to understand that the game is primitive. Okay, let's keep this all in mind. It's in primitive. Therefore, it's also, well, tied in that, it's created by amateurs. Now, amateurs draw things on a basic level, a primitive level. So you're going to have, it's almost like you need to think of it, the way this game is actually achieved is child drawings to an extent. Okay? Everything, and by child drawings, I mean a platonic image. So when you see something, okay, so it's kind of merging with platonic image as well as impressionistic style. The point is, when you see something, the job of this art direction, this style in the game, is that you simply are able to read it. You know what it is. You don't need to read it in the text. You don't need to look at it, saying, oh, you see a tree. You know it's a tree when you see it. You know it's a bush when you see it. You know it's an axe when you see it. Okay? There is fire axe. Now, anyone who sees this knows it's some sort of axe. Okay, it's the same thing with a normal axe. Ah, son of a bitch. Let's do this instead. Small axe. You know this is an axe. Now, is it realistic? No, it's not realistic. I mean, first of all, the perspective, right? But going beyond that, it is not. Um, so I feel like maybe I'm repeating a bit here. So I'm just going to try to drive it home. In terms of approaching how to do Dura's art direction, you need, when you do an image, okay, I'm throwing around these kind of more educational words like impressionistic or platonic or whatever, but another way to think about this, it's all grouped together, is you need to go heavy-handed as opposed to nuanced. You need to go heavy-handed, you need to go ham-fisted, you need to go all in. You want to be one-dimensional, you want to be archetypical, and like I said, you don't want to be nuanced and you don't want to be detailed. You can pretty much look at anything in this game and it's more or less going to be um, one dimension, one idea to the image. Pretty much anything in the game, I don't care where you go, the idea is in whatever sprite, whatever image is being pulled off, it is its own thing independent. It doesn't have two ideas to it. It doesn't have three ideas to it. It doesn't have four ideas. It has one idea. There is a trash bag, excuse me, a trash bin, a wastebasket. It is a circle. It's a container. It's a receptacle. You know it is a wastebasket. It confirms it when you look at it. You're like, oh, I believe that. I buy into that. Same thing with a sign. Same thing with a street lamp. Same thing with a tree. Same thing with a flower. We're actually going to talk about this at another point, but I guess I can talk about it now because eventually in this part two, we're going to talk about color tones. And this is a good image because right now the image on the screen is pretty colorful. You say that you think to yourself, oh man, this is really a polycolor world. It is, but it's deceptive in how it's pulling it off. If you notice here, practically every image in this, every singular image is really one color. Okay? Now it's the merger of all these collected different square meters to create some sort of polycolor image. But if you actually break it down item by item, they more or less achieve it with a dominant color. This is red, green, 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 brown, blue, brown, red, green, red. Well, you could make an argument it's pink or green, but I mean, let's be clear, a lot of these are two-tone, and we'll talk about that later. But what I am trying to emphasize here, to demonstrate, is that if you really break it down, I don't care what it is, any item in the game is really one idea. It is one thing, one conveyance that you are trying to say, this is what this represents. And therefore, the player, as he walks through the world, can intuit that, can understand that. He can orient himself, okay? And it speaks to him. I mean, that's the thing, a lot of the great art that a lot of us love and whatnot, if the greatest art ever was always classicism or neoclassical, meaning it's pretty realistic, right? Anatomical proportions and all that stuff, or even modern art, you have hyperrealism where people draw it with a brush or a pencil, and yet it pretty much looks like a photograph. But what we are drawn to as humankind is lots of times expressionism, impressionism, surrealism, um, symbolism. And the point is, uh, they don't have a great deal of maybe anatomical proportion or accuracy or realistic colors in terms of how the world actually works. It's the same thing with Dura. I mean, you can't really slight it. To be honest with you, even though it's limited on a technological level, the fact of the matter is Dura's art direction is at times breathtakingly beautiful and extremely vibrant. And one of the ways it's doing that is not just consistency, but also clarity and strength of image. Okay. So, going about kind of circling back to what we're talking about with strength of image, again, each individual sprite you're going to create essentially is a platonic image that is not realistic but is impressionistic. And in that platonic image, the practical purpose or job you are trying to deliver is not complex, not detailed, not nuanced. You are trying to give a ham fisted, heavy weighted, this is this thing and nothing else. This is a flower and it is nothing but a flower. This is a flower, this is a crowbar, and the list goes on forever. I mean, I'm not in the actual server, so we're limited on items. I guess if I go to, we'll see some items. I mean, everything in here, we know what it is when we look at it. And if we don't, frankly, then it's not a good sprite and maybe it should be overhauled. But we know this is a statue. We know that, well, it takes maybe time, but we know that's essentially a door. We know this is some sort of magic, looks like some sort of electricity. We know that underneath it is fire. We can have a pretty good take on that this is legs, a pretty good take that this is armor, a pretty good take that that's a shield, a pretty good take that that's a shield. And notice that they're not doing more than that. And I know this might sound super simple, but it is so effing important that anyone that wants to try to sprite for Dura understands this in their bones. The reason is because with modern technology and modern sensibilities and all this other stuff, and also the notion that more is more, people want to try to put a lot of information in a single image. They want to say, they want to really get it in there with detail because they think, okay, to do a good job, I need to get detail. I need to be saying a lot here, and that's not what Dura does. It is a singular image. It is a singular thought. It is a singular feeling. That's what you're trying to do with every item you make. It doesn't matter if it's an equipment piece. Doesn't matter if it's a thing like a chest. Doesn't matter if it's furniture like a bed. Excuse me. Excuse me. Doesn't matter if it's a thing like furniture, like a bed. Doesn't matter if it's a chair. Doesn't matter what it is. Everything is a singular picture, a singular evocation to the mind. Okay. Um, yeah. Yeah. So in practice, we know about the platonic image. We know that extending in towards that platonic image further, we have the idea that you're supposed to create something that is universally understood by any viewer or any audience or any player that that is this thing. We also know that you don't want to go the realistic route to represent this, to get across this idea, to get across this feeling or this conveyance. You do want to go impressionistic. You need breaking that down a little bit more of a particular. For example, there's a lots of items in the game that they are not realistic on so many levels. For example, one is parchment. Now there are many types of parchment, and I'm not going to go digging around. But for example, this is as big as a human being, essentially. In a way, it almost has more presence than my character. That's not realistic. It doesn't matter because it's impression. It tells me what it is, and I buy into it and I understand it. It's like that with anything else in the game. It doesn't matter. You should never be thinking logically when it comes to actually creating the visuals. You should be thinking emotively. You should be thinking, frankly, in terms of feeling, just in terms of instinct. Does this feel like the platonic thing I want to represent. Does it feel like fire? Does it feel like a torch? Okay, does it feel like a counter? Does it feel like a barrel or a beer cask or keg? That's what you need to accomplish. Same thing with the foods. Oh shoot, this is the funny stuff. But this we can tell that this is a leather backpack. So I guess I kind of got to it right away. I mean, it's really that simple. Um, that is your goal, and that should again empower you because you shouldn't think in terms of, oh, this isn't. You should never be held back by any thoughts of, oh, this isn't realistic. Oh, this doesn't make logical sense. Oh, I need more detail. Oh, this seems amateurish. Oh, this seems low bit. This seems low res. No, no, no. If you can get an idea across visually, then you are doing your job. As long as it meets these other parameters, then then it is a good sprite for Dura. Okay. Um, yeah. I mean, I can't believe how quick that was. I feel like I hit everything. I'm gonna be honest with you. Here, let me look. Yep. I mean, no, not good enough. No. Okay. For example, let's talk about the opposite of it. So we're 2D, but some people who do sprites for this game or for for 2D games. They say, well, let's do better, right? Let's try see what they're really trying to do is they're trying to keep pace with the modern world, which is 3D. Okay? So they they're trying to make 3D kind of work in a 2D environment, and it doesn't. And that's where you get a lot of the problems. That's where you get overly bubbly sprites, overly bloated, overly round, way too much detail and information. So detail is information. So way too much detail, way too much going on. And what that ends up doing is it actually creates noise. So instead of getting across a clear image, because remember, impressionism, it doesn't matter how technically sound it is. What matters is what does it do inside you? Like does it move you? Does it does it allow you to grab onto it? Right? And so when you put in all that in a 2D technology, when you put on all that information, you try to go 3D, you try to make it a lot of detail, you try to do all this stuff. What ends up happening is you just cloud the image. You you overwhelm it to the point that it seems very noisy and therefore kind of vague. You can't understand what it is, and therefore it can't speak to you. So, um, yeah, that's another way of looking at it. So I guess, I mean, the last thing I have written down is, so one of the things to definitely take away here is less is more. Um, Big time with this art direction. Less is more. All right. Now there's times for detail. I'm not trying to like, you know what? You guys are, whoever's listening to this, I'm sure you're plenty smart. So of course there are exceptions. There are different ways to apply these rules. Okay. But this is the universal standard. Okay. For the art direction. So that's it. I mean, I finished this part of it. So I think I'm going to try to recap to see if I missed anything. We talked about the technology. We talked about where its base is. We talked about that because of the technology, it demands a minimalistic style, an austere style. Um, Even here, I'll make a small comment. You can see how strong of definition and contrast there is between everything. It's not just separate images like this mailbox versus this sign versus here, and how it's very distinct. But even with bordering, typically in the game you're going to want crisp and distinct bordering because again you don't want it to blend. You want to understand that that is dirt and this is cobblestone or this is stone. It's very very important. So moving forward, then we talked about how um, what you're trying to achieve in the game is not realism. Okay. um, and I think, I mean, we covered Platonic image, we covered Impressionism. I mean, for me, if you had to choose one or the other, I would go Impressionism in terms of really understanding what the art direction is trying to achieve. It is impressionistic at its core. Um, and that really frees you up to do a lot of things, bend a lot of rules. And in terms of a practical application, again, yeah, you need to be doing Impressionism, but when you combine Impressionism with, I guess, Platonic, which is the idea that, well, not No, 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 I take that back. When you combine impressionism with the fact that because of the minimalism and the austerity, you just want to keep it simple. You want one idea most of the time. If you want that, you want to combine impressionism with one idea, it means you need to go heavy-handed. It needs you need to go big. You need to really whatever item you're going to take. So let's go to like a let's what's a hunting ground? We're talking about you need to go heavy. So let's ignore creatures for a second. I mean, no, let's ignore creatures for. Um, I think this is probably a good place. So poison cloud. This is beautiful, just like the energy in the fire. It, it's incredibly simple, but my God, does it work? Okay, it tells us exactly what we need to know, and because of the low res and this is more complicated stuff, but because of the low res and because of the atmospheric and all that stuff, it actually creates a wonderful atmosphere with the proper lighting. I mean, you really feel kind of a threat. Um, and you can again, I mean, this is not advanced stuff in terms of when you look at that. So up here, we have a flask. I think we pretty much know it has a glassy texture. It has a bulbous bottom, so we kind of know that it's a flask or a vial, and it's simple. It's not doing more than that. Okay, same thing with this box, same thing with this cup, same thing with the bookcase. That's a beautiful sprite in terms of this because it is clearly just doing one thing and it's doing it well and it's doing it clear. Um, Beyond that, maybe you have your drawers, you have your table, you have a chair, you have a chest, you have a keg. We've seen a bunch of these sprites. Even this one up here, I mean, especially if we remove this, I mean, we clearly know this is a well. This is an even more modern sprite, but we know this is a well. This is more difficult, admittedly. You're a little bit more unsure what this is. However, this item right here, this black item, well, because of the reflection, we can guess it's either glassy or liquid. Okay, but because of the perfection of it, we can basically intuit automatically that it's not a liquid. It's clearly a solid. Because of the color of it and the fact that it's polished, we can kind of intuit to an extent it's some sort of human item. Okay, and it kind of there is a part of us that the gamers in us, the Dungeons and Dragons in us, that lends it to that it's some sort of magic, some sort of dark. So, and this is a leap though, is that as soon as you look at it and you see it says, oh, you see a mind stone, then you're sold. Then you've bought in. Then you believe. If you had any doubt, now you're not. You're like, no, that makes sense. That is a stone, and now I get it. It's some sort of like magical item. Same thing with the orb and the watch. The watch is perfect. I mean, the watch is a great sprite. Why? Because it's just a watch. It's super simple. It pulls off the idea. It looks good. It fits the world. There's no problem. Same thing with the book. The book is great. I immediately understand what's going on with this is a book. It's doing its job. It's not telling me more that the statue. I mean, I mean, how do I say this? Like, this is the game we play. I mean, I'm not seeing any sprites that are going out of these lines. I mean, a double axe, a knight armor, it's doing the same thing. It's not being complex, you know. Every single sprite on this screen, I could go throughout the entire game. That's what it's doing. Okay. Um, so yeah. So to finalize on that, um, one idea almost always, and go hard. Don't necessarily try to hyper detail it. Don't try to be very complex with it. Get across an image. Um, yeah, I mean that's it. That's 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 I covered everything. So that is Dura's art direction. That's Dura's art style when it comes to that stuff. Now that was the first two parts. There is a third part to this part two, which is intangibles or style. And I'm not joking. I'm going to clarify. It really is that simple. So when you combine this with part one, again, if you're abiding the principles we've laid out, the parameters we've laid out in part one, and if you're abiding these, if you can understand what I'm telling you in terms of style, and you can follow that, again, it will be hard for you not to come up with a sprite. Yeah, maybe a little bit of perseverance. I'm not saying you're going to knock it out in the first 10 minutes of trying, but a couple days, and you will start to literally, again, it'll be hard for you to miss. Okay, now The next thing I'm going to talk about is actually color tones. And I actually have a video from a couple years ago where I talk about it with someone. We discuss it and we talk about how the color works in the game. Um, so I guess I'll cut this in. So, what do you notice about the colors in terms of how many colors there are?
They're minimal,
Exactly.
like two colors, three,
Yes.
four.
Yes, dude. One of the hallmarks of the when it's a good art direction, and it funnels into everything else we've already talked about, is is the art direction almost always is monotone about 20 to 30% of the time. Okay, so monotone, monotone,
Mm.
monotone, monotone. Essentially monotone. You could make an argument it's two tone. This is two tone, arguably monotone, but you can see what I'm talking about. Monotone, monotone,
Yeah.
monotone. Okay, I'd say about 20 to 30% of all the items in the game are monotone. However,
Mm.
it's even more popular. Almost all the items in the game, like 70%, are two tone. They're two tone. Sometimes they have some tertiary color and some quaternary color. But if you look
Mm.
at near every item in the game, two tone, two tone, two tone, monotone, two tone, 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 two tone with tertiary coloring, two tone, two tone, two tone, two tone, two tone with tertiary coloring, two tone, honestly monotone more so, two tone, two tone, two tone, two tone with tertiary coloring, two tone with tertiary coloring, two tone with tertiary coloring. And if you come over here, these are 7.3, 7.4 sprites, this center set, this,
Yeah.
and you can also see these principles are for the most part obeyed. The same thing over here. They're different, it's a little bit more detailed, a little bit more shaded maybe, but at the end of the day, most of what I have already laid out is obeyed here. Now, when you start to get to these more modern sprites, it's going to go out the window. But it is more important to focus on here. So that's it. That's what I'm trying to tell you.
Yeah.
This is like the last thing I would say, which is essential to understand the art direction. So,
Mm.
um, yeah. Any thoughts, questions, responses?
Like I think you said it pretty well, I guess.
Yeah. The other
Yeah.
thing. I'm sorry. Do you have some? You have more?
No, no.
Let's go.
Just continue.
Let's go on a walk. So let's just go through scenery. I mean, if you look at near everything, what is this? I mean, it obeys the same principles as two tone. What is this? This is two tone. I mean, this is two tone. This is one
Mm.
sprite, but it's two tone. And this, here, I'm gonna start doing this for you. This is two tone with
Yeah.
tertiary coloring. I mean, this is monotone. This bed is two tone, arguably monotone. It's two tone. I mean, with a
Yeah.
little bit of tertiary. I mean, this mailbox, it's monotone with some just shading on this monotone
Yeah.
color. This billboard is two tone. It's 100% two tone. Now you can make an argument. No, but it's tertiary color. I mean, this is a
Yeah.
two tone. All right, let's go to like Thias. I mean, everything here. I don't even need to fucking look before I speak because I just know. Because it's the way the whole game operates. Like fuck specifics, patterns.
Mm.
Every single thing on this screen right now is two tone or monotone.
Yeah.
Okay, it's heavy-handed. It's all that stuff. Okay, I mean, look at these flowers. These flowers are amazing. Everyone loves these flowers. They're two-tone and they're simple
Yeah.
and they're super heavy-handed and super impression. Whoa. Okay, there we go. Impression. Look at the trees.
Yeah.
The trees are two-tone. Yeah, they got some shading, sure, but they're two-tone and
Yeah.
they're an impression. I mean, no tree actually looks like this. This is an impression. So anywhere we
Mm.
go in the game, it doesn't matter where we go. Let's go to add editor. These principles are obeyed. Look at every single tile here is two tone or monotone. This thing is
Yep.
fucking two tone. You know, and
Mm.
I mean, yeah, and everything obeys this rectangular as opposed to rounded. Everything is sharp. Everything is thin. Um,
Yep.
it's minimalistic, little details and impression. That's it. That's what I have.
Mm.
That's what I have to pass on. This is the art direction that is the best for the
Yeah.
game, in my opinion. And any art direction that goes outside of this, in my opinion, is frankly just not optimal. It's because of the way the game is structured. It's because of how the technology works. So
Yeah, it's because you're limited to like the amount of pixels, so it gets more squared.
absolutely. So
Yeah.
you can already see this. So that's everything. That's it. Yeah, and we can like go to people's houses, like this guy. Like, look at, I mean, everything in there is like, it's very heavy handed. At the same time, except for the gems, it's sharp. And it's two tone or
Mm.
monotone.
Yeah.
I mean, it doesn't matter. Like, I guess Edron, right? I don't know, fuck it. Let's go to Thias. Zodit. Let's go to these guys. I know these guys have a house. It might not be updated, though. Looks updated, though. Okay, hold on. There you are. So, like, I mean, the runes are two tone. Granted, the tone
Mm.
is always black, but yeah, it's two tone. This stuff, this house. Here, I'll just bring you into here. I might not be able. Yeah, I can't bring you into this house. Fuck, I can't bring you into
Mm.
this.
You can bring it to my house
Oh
in
yeah,
Vilor.
that's right. That's right. I know you do have that house. I mean, everything in your house, dude. Look at this mastermind shield. I mean, it's a
Mm.
beautiful. It's sharp. You know, it's got a lot of shading. It's one of the more advanced pieces in the early game. There's no question. But
Yeah.
it's like mono. It's like 1.5 tone. I mean, but you
Mm.
can see where it's coming from. But yeah, everything here, like this blood herb, is two tone, and it's even though it's trying to be rounded, it still comes up because it's not like it's pixelated. So it just
Yeah.
has that old feel. I mean, this item is
Mm.
two tone. All these items, and they're all. I mean, you can see it, man. You're a smart guy. You don't need me to keep pointing it out.
Yeah, I
Like even
get what you mean.
look at this item. It's super. This item's super primitive. This item is probably from the 6.0, 4.0 era. I mean, it still obeys
Mm.
these principles. Same thing with this.
Mm.
So, these banners. They're look at them. They're two tone impressions. This
Mm.
lamppost, two tone impression.
True.
So all these bushes we can see below us. So, anyways, once you kind of, I think once you wrap your head around it, I mean, it took me a long time to get, I guess this far, but once you understand this, it's kind of simple what the game's actually doing, and it's one of those things where it really, bespeaks the phrase "less is more." The next thing, um, is just one more thing that's very important stylistically. So we talked about how this is a 2D game. We talked about how it's a minimalistic game. Um, and we talked about a lot of other stuff. So what we also mentioned though is because it is impressionistic versus realistic, and because it is a 2D game, we err away from bubbliness, from roundness, um, and over detail. So one of the things to understand of this game is it's actually incredibly. The game is not rotund. So something else to talk about is we talked about where the origins of this game are. There's an origin where the technology is in terms of like literally the technology, 2D, flat aerial view. We talked about the minimalism, and those are important origins. We also talked about, but one thing we didn't talk about is the origin. But where is the game coming from culturally? Where is the game coming in? What are its precursors? What influenced it on a visual level, on an animated level? And that's pretty simple. It's really the 1970s and 80s. Okay, um, that's where this stuff is coming from. Yeah, you could make an argument. It's all the way, it's back thousands of years. Of course you could, but more recently, it's really the 70s and 80s that's informed the game. You could argue again Lord of the Rings from all the way back to the 40s, and surely it did. But the thing is, the 70s, Lord of the Rings got a lot more famous in the 70s, or at least it had another wave. Um, Now, what I mean is, why is the game coming from that time? Well, if you actually, this is going to require a little leap on your part to put it together. But if you think about how Dura's art direction actually works, what its style is like, and then you think about the movies that came out in the 70s and 80s, and the shows and the other stuff as well. So something that springs to mind is even 101 Dalmatians in the 60s, but in the 70s and 80s, you have I believe, the Sword in the Stone. You have The Sword in the Stone, which is actually Disney. You have The Secrets of Nim. You have Great Mouse Detective, which is dark as hell, actually, in terms of like the visuals. Um, you also have The Land Before Time, um, and you have a lot of other things at that time, like uh, you have a lot of the 80s cartoons. I'm not, I didn't grow up in the 80s, so I don't know all of them by name. But if you can just picture for a second what 80s cartoons look like, you'll start to get an imprint in your head. And you could actually make the same leap for things that come out of Japan at that time. So you do have Dragon Ball and Dragon Ball Z. You do have this is late 80s, but even earlier 80s, you have Gundam, I think it is, and whatnot. But particularly let's focus on the films that we were mentioned. Let's focus on the Lord of the Rings film at that time, which was animated. Um, and what you kind of get is the fact that everything is 2D, everything is hand drawn. It's not oversaturated, like in between the lines would be a marker. No, it's pencil. There's clearly a feeling that there's almost this like it's not oversaturated. Okay, and because everything is 2D drawn, things have a certain sharpness to them. Okay, so and then the other thing, the kingmaker for me is Dungeons and Dragons and what came out of that time. So if you actually look at the artwork of Dungeons and Dragons from the 70s and the 80s, well, I'm going to show you later in a reference in part three of inspiration and reference, but you're going to see some massive consistencies and massive similarities. But even other things, there was like all the 80s. There was a lot of 80s shows. Again, I don't know the name. Um, but like almost like the heavy metal, hair metal shows and whatnot. Oh, the one that with like a tiger. What's that show called? I don't know, man. There was a ton at that time. But that's where you're pulling from. Okay, that's where the art direction is. But again, though, a lot of it you want to just put into Dungeons and Dragons. So the reason I'm saying all this is because that's where the origin is. Okay, so that's where things are coming from. Okay, that's what the immediate influences were for the people that were drawing these sprites. And remember, the people that were drawing a lot of these sprites, most of the sprites were players, right? They were just volunteer players. Um, so, so what does that mean? Well, if we think about that time period, and I'll show you later in references in part three, you have what I lay out here. You have a minimal, sharp, clean, distinguishable style. I mean, you can't say more than that. So one thing to think of on a very basal level is, you know, um, it is not round, or excuse me, it's not circles. This game is not circles. This game is right angles. There is no question. All right, it's sharp points. It's not curvatures. Um, so we talked a little bit, I think, about 2D versus 3D, and how 3D you kind of have curvatures to it. You kind of have a bit more roundness. Even when we think about 2D animation in the 1990s for Disney and the 1980s and 70s that we already talked about, we compare that to Pixar in the late 90s and all the way into the 2000s with all the different studios that started to do 3D. It is by its nature, it seems a bit more rounded, seems a bit more bulbous, seems a bit more curved. Okay, whereas 2D is seemingly just it has by its nature a little bit more of a sharpness to it, a little bit of a fine point. And so that's important to understand. When you're pushing towards 3D, okay, you're going to get those types of more shapes. When you're pushing towards 2D, you're going to get more of these types of shapes. So what I'm trying to say is fundamentally, if you want to think of it in a kind of very subconscious or subliminal level, you have 3D is a circle, okay, and that's not what Dura does, right? What Dura does is a square. What Dura does is a right angle. So words in terms of specifics of material description, sharp, pointed, um, right angle. Verse, round, circly, bubbly, bulbous. No. Um, And it's really that simple. And what happens is when you pull, no, great, granted, both are good, all right, but you know, it all depends. It depends on a lot of different circumstances. But with this one, what Dura does, we do the minimum, we do the sharp, we do the clean, we do the distinguishable, and that is so much of what makes the actual art direction the art direction. Again, with the limited technology and all that other stuff we've already talked about, it's ultimately if you keep it, if you do minimal, if you do sharp, if you do right angle as opposed to bulbous and bulky, you're going to get a more crisp and more readable image. Okay. The other thing about it is stylistically, a lot of the stuff that came out of the 70s and 80s that's 2D drawn, it's kind of got there's a real level of scare to it. There's a real level of frightened. There's a real level of threat. I think we all kind of know that without much explanation. When we look at a lot of the games that come out in the 2000s, the 2010s and 20s, it is more round, it is more bulbous, and also it's kind of almost it's like it's pandering to a more of a kind of mm, more lighthearted, free. I don't want to say actually words that I don't want to say those words. So it oh, Jesus, I'm getting tired. When you think of those modern games, you there's something to them that has a little bit more of less threat to it, a little bit more that it feels more friendly. It just it doesn't have that same level of fierceness, and honestly, a lot of that can be reflected in the shaping. I mean, quite literally, on a very simple psychological level, a circle or a curvature is just a lot less threatening. It doesn't trigger a fight or flight response like a point does. If I show you a shape of a triangle, two lines meeting with a sharp point, and I show you a curvature that basically resembles a half shaped moon. I mean, you will absolutely trigger a fight or flight response higher with the point. So what I'm trying to also make the case for is because everything we do in Dura is right angle versus circle, is sharp, and kind of tight versus bubbly and bulbous and round. Because you do that, because we do that, it actually makes it so intrinsically, by its nature, things are just a little bit more threatening, a little bit more scary, a little bit more frightening. Um, and I bring that up because if you look at the stuff that came out with the 70s and 80s, and that is hand drawn and whatnot, and in the early 90s as well, you will see that. You will see how it things come across. I don't know how to explain it. They just come across with a little bit more scare to them, a little bit more fright, um, more threat. So, anyways, all of that is just trying to get to the point that Dura, in our art direction, you want to think, well, you don't want to think circle. You don't want to think round. You don't want to think bulbous. Bulbous and bulky kind of come back to that too much information thing. You don't want to think over detail. What you want to do is you want to think minimal. You want to think crisp. You want to think something with bite to it, something that has a fine line, something that is real sharp. Um, and again, that's a basic parameter where if you can kind of play with that, excuse me, abide to that, as opposed to its opposite, it just makes it so, again, it is hard for you to make an error. Okay, that's it. Done.